Hello, welcome to the Eternal Possibility Hour. I am Esther Piszczek, and I am so excited to introduce you to my friend, David Cowardin, who is the owner of the film production company Blue Forest Films here in Duluth, Minnesota, where I am, and also works at University of Minnesota Duluth as a video production artist. So, welcome, David.
Hello, thanks for having me, Esther.
Yeah, you are welcome. So I would love, you have all kinds of things that you do. You are also an author of the book Down South Justice. And we met years ago because I asked you to do a film for me,
Mhm.
an art documentary called Life and Art Entangled. But you primarily focus on adventure films. And I would love to hear how you got interested in filmmaking and what your journey has been.
Yeah, well, I guess my introduction to video production started in college when I was writing for the student newspaper here at UMD. I just instinctively picked up a camera to shoot photos for the stories that I was writing. Maybe to back up a little bit further, I'm trained in English and journalism, so I didn't go to school for for doing what I'm doing, which is kind of funny, but mostly self-taught, but use a lot of my the skills that I did acquire in college, and also through working at a TV news station here in Duluth, um, to do what I'm doing now. So, um, but I guess like if I were to really kind of like turn back the clock, I think like my passion for creativity started at a really young age. I always just had the urge to create things. And I remember my ninth grade creative writing class in high school was sort of that moment for me where I felt really engaged in what I was learning. And when we have an assignment to write a creative story, I would turn in two, because it was just something that I had, I was enjoying it. And that was kind of new for me when it came to school and learning. Um, and so that sort of carried forward, and that's why I ended up going to school for English and journalism, because I wanted to continue um, being engaged in that way. And and then it just evolved, that passion for creativity and telling stories in new ways, transformed into picking up a camera, shooting photos, and then ultimately recording video stories. It was sort of a natural progression. I didn't know it at the time, but that was kind of where my journey was going. um, and so, yeah, here I am today, telling stories for the University of Minnesota Duluth. So I work in the marketing PR department. So a lot of those stories are, marketing the university, telling stories about our students, our faculty, research stories that our faculty are involved with that have impact in the community, student success stories, and then a variety of other projects too. So, but I think it's that the story aspect and the writing and storytelling that really kind of shaped my trajectory of where I am right now.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you started in English and journalism and then progressed with the camera, and then those still photos became moving pictures with the film, showing things. But it's a very different process to take a story and write it. I'm also a writer, so I understand that process. To take a story and write it down, but then to actually take those words and kind of the images that you're asking people to create in their mind, but then actually finding the images and the music and the spoken word and then weaving all that together in a film. I think it's very, very different, and it's a hugely creative process. So can you talk to me about kind of making that shift?
Yeah, well, I guess I'd like to start with kind of sharing a fun new process that I have. So there's all these new AI tools that are coming onto the scene, and there is one that I've been actually using in my process now for video production, and it's a text-based editing. And so basically, you can load a clip, an interview clip, into your software. It transcribes it for you. Then you have a visual document of everything that was spoken in the interview. And then you can just go in and start to to pull things together like you would create a written story, and it just kind of, it will pull the clips in the spots that you put them. And so that's kind of like what I used to do when I wrote for the newspaper, was working in a text document. And so I'm kind of like doing what I used to do, but it's helping me with, you know, creating video content, which is kind of fun. But to kind of answer, that's kind of a tangent, but to answer your question, like making that transition from, you know, the written aspect of storytelling to presenting that visually, I think for me, like the hardest part was to figure out how to focus the story and let the visuals have presence too. Rather than saying everything, you want to be able to, you know, say things with visuals too. And that's been, it's a balance, right? Like you have to, what I do is I just kind of feel it out. I mean, there's all sorts of things we could talk about as far as capturing that content goes, but when it comes to putting together, it's sort of a meditative process of, you know, moving things into place and then just feeling what it feels like, and if it feels right, and if the content that is presenting itself advances the story that you want to tell in a meaningful way, then kind of know you've arrived at a good point in the process. But yeah, that did take me some time, because initially I tried to put a little bit too much, tell too much of a story, and now I've kind of dialed it back to really focus on maybe a central theme of a story, and let characters present themselves naturally through, you know, both what they say but also the visuals that are on the screen. And it's daunting. Like every time I start a project, I'm worried about, am I going to capture it, you know, in both ways, you know, the audio of the interview, the spoken word, but also that visual aspect, because they're both so important and they both have to be present to, you know, to do the job effectively.
Yeah, and you don't always know what the full, I mean, I'm assuming this from working with you. We've worked on 2 film projects together and one recently. And I know that when I went into it with you, as it was a both were art documentary style films, that I gave you an idea of what I wanted, but the story itself, you pulled out of the footage. And I think that when you are filming, at least from my experience, you know, we captured 7 hours of film for the latest film, Discovery. It ended up being 5 minutes and 31 seconds of footage that was presented. And you know, the interview process was like an hour or so, or more, or a little bit less than that. But that's a lot to go into what was really maybe, I don't know, 2.5 minutes of actually spoken word during the actual film. So there's that balance between, okay, I have to get all of my visuals and all of the sound and all of the interview before I really know what the story is, right? So how do you deal with all of that? So taking 7 hours of footage and then bringing it down, just to use the film that I'm familiar with as an example.
Yeah, so I guess from a tactical standpoint, when I'm in my video editing software, I'll watch the interview, or in this new scenario with this new AI tool, I'll read the transcription, and then I'll try to identify a particular theme that's popping up, and start to find elements of that interview or that story that support that theme. And then it makes it a lot easier to start trimming, because that's a hard thing to do. There's so many good stories that could be told out of an hour-long interview that we record, but we kind of have to focus on a particular one that helps to kind of unveil the character of someone. So and so that's what I try to do, is find a theme that supports the unveiling of the character, and then it becomes a lot easier. But finding that is the hard part. And my practice in the last several years has been to have those conversations with a subject before we even start recording. So for example, I've shot a number of stories for a credit union in Duluth or on the North Shore, that are called Shining Examples. And so they basically wanted me to create stories about their members. And so one of the most recent ones was a family that got a construction loan to build a house. And so my job was to learn what that house meant to them. And so that was a process of talking with them on the phone for over an hour one night to try to figure out, what does this mean to you? Like, what does this idea of, building this house mean to you? And initially, that subject kept saying, well, I'm just a hard worker. I have a lot of, perseverance, essentially. And after talking and talking, it kind of, we kind of learned that, she brought up this story about how, I'm trying to think of a way to really simplify it. It's essentially she had a stillbirth, so she lost her daughter, and that was sort of in the process of creating this new home. And so this idea of home included visions of her with her daughter, and so she kind of talked about how she had to, kind of follow through with this dream, knowing that it's not going to look the same, essentially. And so that was really powerful. So we kind of, focused on that aspect, but without having that conversation ahead of time, and going blindly into an interview, I wouldn't have known the right questions to ask. And so so that's a process of vulnerability and trust and curiosity, and then a lot of self-awareness on the subject side, which is a lot of fun because we get to, I get to, walk with these people in their own self-discovery to figure out, what does this thing mean to you, which is a question that maybe they don't always ask themselves. So it's really fun to see that, unveil itself.
Yeah, people's stories are fascinating, which is why I started this project, because I think that people's stories are fascinating, and we can just walk around town and think, oh, well, that person doesn't have anything interesting going on in their lives. But the truth is, every single person has something super amazing and interesting going on in their lives that is a connecting point for all of us. And that's what I love about your work, is that it's really, everything that I've seen of yours is so thoughtfully put together and so skillfully done and so heart-centered that it's like truly magical what you do with film and sound and story points.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm a highly sensitive person. I kind of always have been. I guess I don't really know where I'm going with that, but I really like to find, the heart stories, right? Like what makes people tick and what makes people motivated to do the things that they want to do in life. And that's really fun for me. So I see a lot of things in pictures and memories, and we just have that urge to create and be that, like you mentioned, that conduit of, because as a storyteller, someone described it as kind of like an hourglass, like everything kind of comes, you're taking in that information and you're kind of that center point, and then you're pushing it back out, which I thought was a really awesome way to kind of describe what an artist does, essentially.
Yeah, you're actually kind of birthing the form.
Right.
A person has their whole life experience, and then you come in and you ask certain questions and really bring it down into this this focal point that you were talking about in the beginning. And then you're using the images and the music and the silence, really, those moments of silence and expression on people's faces, and then allow that to be the bottom part of the hourglass that just kind of filters out and creates this moment that's really beautiful.
Yeah, and that's a really scary process too, because as a storyteller, it's my perspective of that person and their story, and so that can be a hard thing. So I'll create something and share it, and I'm nervous, right? Because I don't know what that reaction is going to be to how how they see that final piece, that interpretation that I have of their story and their life. And so it's very nerve-wracking to me. But a lot of times what I find is that it's sort of a therapeutic process for them too, like, to sort of see themselves in a different light.
Yeah, I mean, it was that way for the first film we worked on together, Life and Art Tangled, because I didn't know you at all. You were recommended to me by somebody in Duluth that somebody would be the perfect, person for this project. And you were working with Joe Oliveri at that point through Little Visuals. And I remember we just sat down and you started filming this piano that I'd been working on and drawing on. And you guys just started asking me questions. And I had no idea that anything that I said was actually going to make it into the film. And then in the end, it was like, it really like took my breath away how you pulled this, put this whole story together. And it was really just so raw because it wasn't at all scripted at all. We were just kind of getting to know each other because there was nothing else to do while you were filming. So we were just chatting.
Right. Yeah, I suppose you could call that maybe a trick of some sort, when sometimes I call it like an active interview where I'll have the microphone on someone as they're doing something. And sometimes I realize that distraction for them kind of helps them center themselves a little bit. And I've also, with some of the work I've done, I haven't used my actual video camera when I record the interview. I just do audio, so it's a little bit less intimidating, because when you have a camera in front of someone and a light, all of a sudden they don't know what their name is.
Right. Yeah,
and
it can be a little overwhelming.
Right. Yep. So that's been fun too, and that allows me to focus more too. I'm not worried about what the camera is doing. I'm not worried about the light or anything else. I'm just more present in the conversation.
And do you do those before you do the visuals, the interview?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
So I guess so that process has been more of something I've done with my outdoor films. For a lot of my other work, I kind of have to record the video for a lot of the marketing stuff I do, but for the passion projects I do, that's something that I've tried a little bit more and seems to work pretty well. But then you have to really lean on the visuals that you capture. So you have to know that you're going to capture content that's going to support that story, because you don't have a visual of them talking. You just have the audio. Right.
But you also then have the opportunity to say, okay, here's my framework. I have this interview. And then, okay, what visuals what is going to support this? What can I do? How can I bring this, the spoken part of it to life through visual representation?
Yeah, exactly. And that's probably my most favorite part, especially with the passion projects, where I have time to sit on it a little bit and envision like what the project could be. And of course there's things that you can't control. The visuals have to be captured maybe on a certain day or at a certain event, but there is some control that you can have creatively. So for example, one of my most recent outdoor adventure films was about a gravel cycling event organizer. It's called The Good Line. So that's kind of his tagline for his event company is Ride the Good Line. And so essentially that the idea for that project came about of just curiosity, like what does that mean for him? And so that's sort of what we explored in the interview. But that was a process where I just recorded the sound for a couple hours about his upbringing, his what he does professionally, and how all that kind of ties together with his gravel cycling events and what that means for him. And essentially we kind of landed on the story about him finding a lot of answers to big questions he had in his life while going on these long gravel cycling events. That repetitive motion for him was really therapeutic and helped him, like I mentioned, sort of answer some big questions that he had in his life. And so the visuals for that were you know, him riding his bike and him organizing an event and other bikers taking part in that event. But there was one moment where I was able to sort of script it in a way where we had him in a little creek, sort of in this like baptism moment where he's laying in the water. He kind of submerges himself in the water, and there's a drone shot that kind of goes up as he's doing that, and it's this beautiful moment. And so that was more of like a scripted narrative element within this more documentary style production, which I really enjoyed, that kind of weaving those two different styles together. And I want to do more of that too. But
Yeah, I saw the good line because it's on the bottom of your email, and I'm going to link that here so everyone watching this can see it as well. It's short and it's just beautifully done. And that moment was my favorite moment, that drone shot and the entire thing. And we're going to show a little montage video in a few minutes here. And it's included in that montage. So I'm super excited to share that with people. So I wanted to ask you about that shot, and we'll do it now because we're talking about it. The drone is so still. It's like you were standing on a tower looking down at that final shot. Like how does that happen? I know I'm probably sure it's a technology issue,
right.
but it's also still on your part. I'm like, how do you get, this is Misha. She usually enters at some point during every interview. How do you get that? How did you get that shot?
Yeah, so that was essentially, you know, most drones these days have an electronic gimbal that keeps the camera stable, and you can point the camera up or down. And so I basically, it's kind of it's a bird's eye shot essentially. So you just have the camera pointed straight down, and you lift the drone up, or you lower it down, or you just have it, you know, steady. So that's what I tried with that shot. I like that perspective where you have a lot of symmetry in the frame. And but actually that particular scene, well, and that was another you know, act of vulnerability. When I introduced the idea to him, I said, what do you think? Because he had mentioned in his interview how he'd, you know, clean off in a creek or a lake or something on his adventures. So I thought, well, do you want to try doing that for the film? Do you want to go for a little swim in a creek? And you know, he said yes. And that was actually in the fall, so it was starting to get really cold out. And so we kind of have a little inside joke about that little spot where we filmed it is, we kind of refer to that as hypothermia hole, because he got really, really cold and we had to go to the car and warm up. And I had a tin of almonds in my car that he just wolfed down, and we blasted the heat. So I'm thankful for him for playing along with that. But and then I was also, you know, in my boxer shorts in the creek with him when I was getting some of the shots. So it's just kind of a funny, you know, if you could see like the behind the scenes of that, you'd probably laugh. But
Well, it paid off. It paid off big time, because it's a beautiful shot. And it's a beautiful moment in the film. It really does capture that really human story that he's telling about. He's talking about his marriage and a difficulty in his marriage, and it really just captures that kind of introspective moment of him doing this adventure thing, but yet having all of this, the weight of, you know, his emotion on him. And it's really
right. Yeah, and that was something where, you know, I recorded the interview and just kind of sat on it and thought about, you know, how, you know, I'm not going to really have a visual to represent him going on these adventures on his own. So how am I going to show that on camera? Of course, we can get him riding his bike, but that gets repetitive after a while. So I tried to think of a way to break up the visual and you know, have some moments that speak for themselves visually, where he's submerging himself, and like you mentioned, there's all this, you know, pent up weight on him, emotional weight, and then all of a sudden he emerges from that, and you know, we're into a more light, happy scene of him embracing his family at the finish line of a race. And but yeah, I mean, I go, when I'm working on those projects, I go to bed at night and those are just spinning. It kind of drives me crazy, but I must enjoy it if I think about it all the time.
Yeah, and you keep doing it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the things that I love about what you do in particular, but also about film. I mean, even if you just go to a movie, there's a certain element, a collaboration I find between the filmmaker and everybody who works on a film. So even your subject and all of the ancillary players that show up in your work, whether it even just be the bicycle or the road or the creek, or all of those things are playing a role in creating the atmosphere and really bit parts, but important parts in the story. But then there's also the audience, right? So then the audience, you can't, as you were talking about with when you're writing words, here you're adding visuals. You have to allow those visuals to really speak so that the audience has their own experience and you're not just force feeding them this thing. Like they have to come to their own conclusions. And that really takes a real I think you were talking about sensitivity, kind of a sensitive awareness of the balance of how to convey that.
Right. No. And I think that kind of goes back to that process of just feeling your way through an edit, essentially. So I'll compile the elements and then I'll play them back and I'll just kind of ask myself, like, what do I feel like I need in this particular spot? Like, what do I need a break? Do I want to just continue the spoken word in the story? Does it need to go quickly here just to get some details across, or do we need a moment of pause? And that's just my own like sensitivity and feeling my way through it. Which is it's like putting a puzzle together, essentially. That's kind of the best analogy I can. It's not a great analogy, but it is kind of like puzzle work in a way.
Well, I think it's not a great analogy in the sense that puzzle pieces are specific and they have to go in one particular place, where you're working with
Exactly.
many pieces that can go all kinds of different directions. And so what you're doing, I think, is actually far more challenging than putting a puzzle together. But I think it is a fabulous analogy in that, and I feel this way about every time I put up an art exhibit. I've got this chaos in the middle and this blank wall and all of these parts. And then when the last part comes into place, it's just like this piece comes over the entire project. You're like, okay, yes, it's done. It has spoken. It has become what it wanted to become. And that is, yeah, it's such a beautiful moment.
Interesting.
Do you feel that way?
Yeah, I guess so you feel that way at the end. Is that what I'm
Yes.
hearing?
And I
Yeah.
know, yeah, I know when it's done, when I feel that peace. And up until that very
Oh.
moment, if there's one thing that's out of place, and I don't know where the places are. Just like you have all these pieces, you don't know where the places are, but when you find the place, when the puzzle piece slides in perfectly and it's the last one, you're like, all right, yeah,
Right.
it's really beautiful.
Yeah, I definitely feel that in a sense when I do finish a project and, all of the elements are together, but I think I feel that more when I've identified the story and I know like what the message is that I want to convey. That's the part that haunts me. And once I figure that out, I'm like, oh yeah, that's the story. Now I can rest a little bit easy and I can get some sleep and I can, go into the edit with a little bit more of an idea of direction.
Right.
That's when I find the peace in a project.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And then, the visuals, as long as I've captured them appropriately, then they kind of end up falling in place once I've established that narrative structure. Then I can kind of move things a little bit this way or that way and, feel my way through it.
Yeah, that's so fabulous. So you mentioned passion projects a couple of times, and you talked about the good line. Are there other, can you talk more about what passion projects mean to you?
Yeah, I guess they're just, like in my industry, there's people who have opinions about passion projects. Some people think, you have to be paid for what you're doing. I I totally get that, but there's certain things that I just have to do, and so I do them. And sometimes they take a long time. Like the good line, for example, I think it took over 2 years. Like I recorded the interview and I sat on it for a year, mostly because I'm a busy person. I have 2 little kids at home, but I communicated that with the subject to him, like this is a passion thing. I'm not sure when I'm going to get around to it, but it'll happen one way or another. And luckily, he's a very amazing person and was understanding of that, and has a family of his own, so he can relate in that aspect. But what was your question again?
Well, what passion project means to you? And now I'm questioning,
Oh, yeah.
actually, does that mean that passion project means you're not getting paid, or you're not getting
No, I don't
full,
think
or
so, because I
okay,
have found, after the fact, after I have that initial urge to create something, I have found, sponsors, for
okay,
example.
because it seemed like that was a sponsored film, so that's why I was wondering about that.
Yeah, yeah. And so sometimes after the fact, I mean, that's not like the best way to do it. A lot of times it's, have an idea, pitch that idea, find the money for it, and produce it. Um, I, I was thinking about this the other day. I had like a drink koozie that I got through a men's hockey league, and I was looking at that in the bottom of my bag. I'm like, I'm never going to use that because I'm not the person that sips on things. I just like I chug it down. I just go full force ahead. If I have an idea, I just want to do it and figure out the rest later.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's kind of my personality. If I have an urge to do something or create something, I'm just going to do it, and the rest will figure itself out. And
So did the good line come to you? Was that your idea, or did you know him beforehand?
I had followed what he was doing with his races, and my wife's a hairstylist, and he and his wife come to my wife to get their hair done. So I can't remember where I initially met him. His wife also works at UMD as a writing studies instructor, and I don't remember that initial introduction to them, but no, it was something where I reached out to him, and I think I actually asked him if he had anyone involved with his races that may have an interesting story to tell, because what I really was drawn to about his events were that they were very accessible. So the idea wasn't to win necessarily; it was to have this experience and community. And so I was curious about that, like what kind of people are taking part in this race. And so he had one idea of a person who didn't want to have a film about that person made. But then Jeremy is his name, the event coordinator. He said, well, maybe I actually have this story that and some things that I could share if you're interested. So that's sort of how it came about.
It's really great. So you're in this little montage that we're going to show. There are a couple of other stories, and what I really love about this montage is that you took all of these different stories and then you created a story out of the stories, and they're completely different. So can you talk about how that came together?
Yeah, so I guess a lot of filmmakers have a reel to kind of highlight some of their work, and so I thought, well, maybe I should have one, right? I'm going to market myself, and so I took a few of the stories that I was really passionate about, essentially, and wove clips and the audio together to create sort of a highlight reel of my artistry. And that was another thing where I was looking for those themes, and a series of those videos that I created, I kind of titled Watershed Moments. So they're about people who are sort of in the outdoor industry, or enjoyed outdoor recreation of some sort, and that was sort of and they have these watershed moments in their life while doing that activity, and so that was sort of a theme that popped up, is that this outdoor recreation allowed me the time and space to have self-awareness. And so I kind of wove those stories together in what I think was a artful way to display some of my work.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to talk about that before we show the clip, about any of the stories or the shots?
I don't think so. Maybe we could watch it and see what
Yeah, let's
questions
watch it.
arise. Yeah.
Exciting. Okay, let me pull that up.
If I were to have never branched out, and I've said this a million times over, I'd have probably been dead by now.
In gravel cycling, there's a line that you have to take to get through a corner, or you inherently just take it because gravity pushes you that way.
I have a really intimate relationship with my bicycle. Around the time I turned 20, I was in an unhappy relationship, and to get away from my relationship, I started riding my bike to work.
They thought my chemotherapy would be 5 to 6 months, which puts me right at the start of the kayaking season.
As a young kid, I wanted to be Indiana Jones and a marine biologist. I was the youngest of 4, and all my siblings were 3-sport athletes, and that was just the narrative that I was going to follow.
There was a time that I got away from art and the outdoors a little bit, and I call those the lost years.
You take 20 years of progression through life, and you realize that you're starting to drift off the road pretty hard, and you're not on the good line anymore. Your life is getting rusty.
And if you don't get called on the carpet, or you don't find a watershed moment in your life, you'll just continue.
It was like a slap to my heart. That's when I started to rethink about this.
It's so good for the soul. The river's never the same twice, and that's kind of a big cliche, but it's true.
Get 3/4 of the way up that hill or that mountain, and you're like, oh my God, I can see the top. I didn't know that I could do this.
When you see the work that goes into it, when you see brushstroke, when you see chisel marks, when you see the actual painter, I feel like that's real work.
When you crest wherever you're cresting, or you pop out and you hear it or you see it, the water, euphoria.
David, that was amazing. I had goosebumps while I was watching that. I mean, there's so many cool shots in there. And how do you feel about watching that back now, just in this moment?
Yeah, well, when you asked me to do this interview and asked for a clip, I hadn't watched that in a while, and I kind of had goosebumps at certain parts too, which was really fun for me, because when you get so close to a project, you don't really feel that all the time. But it's fun to look back at it, and it's sort of reinvigorating in a way. It makes me want to go out and do something like that again, you know.
Yeah, so one of the questions I had after I watched that clip was, you're doing these adventure films, and there's some pretty intense shots there, like the kayaker going over that, the huge
Yeah.
drop of water, the waterfall, and there's a part where you're zooming in and then you're out in the trees, and like, how do you deal? Are there technical challenges to capturing those shots that you could tell us about, and how you deal with them?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, capturing these logistically is just very challenging. So the biking one, for example, most of those shots I was sitting on the tailgate of a truck, while my friend was driving it, and so there's communication through the window, and there's started to mist out, and so I'm dealing with that as well, and my focus issues, not being quite right on certain parts. So there's all sorts of just technical challenges that go into it. Then you get back and you look at everything you captured, and hopefully you have a good hit rate, that most of the stuff that you captured is usable. There's another story I created a long time ago about brook trout fishing in northern Minnesota, where a group of us floated a river in a very wilderness area, and so I had to be floating myself and finding ways to capture the group floating, through these tight spaces with some rapids, and so I have to paddle out ahead of the group sometimes and pull over and get out of the raft and figure out good angles and situations to be in. But also, keep all my equipment safe and dry. We, make camp along the river and very wet environments, and so that's challenging too. The hypothermia whole example that I brought up earlier, those challenges. But I love that. Like that's part of what I really like, because it's like I'm part of that adventure. Like we're on an adventure together, sort of, and I get to experience a lot of what the subject is experiencing, which is really fun for me. And then that helps sort of inspire new ideas about how I can capture something too, and feel the project a little bit more closely.
So is there anything that you would tell somebody who wants to sees this and is inspired, so inspired that they want to do their own work, even if it's just from an amateur perspective, like capturing family events? Is there something that you can share with them about how to go about that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's all sorts of technical advice I could give, but they can probably find that in other places. I suppose the best advice I could give is just to follow your curiosity. Like what are the questions that you have that you want to answer through whatever medium it is that you're using, whether it's photography or videography or painting or whatever it is. Listen to those little questions that arise, because they arise for a reason, and there's usually ways that you can explore those questions through art, and that's what I love to do. This is sort of a tangent, but I guess a lot of my work, it's not necessarily following that, those pieces of curiosity. It's marketing. So I'm having to use storytelling to help businesses grow, and to help like the institution, the University of Minnesota Duluth where I work, to help tell those stories. And so that can be kind of a challenge sometimes, where it's more assigned creativity, but there are ways to still be creative in that world too.
Yes, you started out talking about the woman who had a stillbirth, and we're talking about the house.
Mm-hmm.
Did UMD know when they said go interview this woman that was part of her story? I kind of doubt that was.
Oh, and no, this was for a credit union.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry, I'm confusing
that
them.
loaned her the money for the construction. Yeah.
And did they know about that personal part of her story when they asked you to use her as a subject?
I think they did, because I think she's good friends with someone who works there. And so when they start to identify people, they kind of have that in the back of their mind, I think, but I still had to uncover that story. So yeah, and that's a series that's kind of, it has good momentum now. So, they know what to look for in their clients and their members. But it's still my job to tell those stories, and to, be that center point of the hourglass and push it out,
What are you working on now that's exciting for you?
Oh boy. Well, I did start a passion project last winter about a group of women who are leading this. It's called the Mother Puckers. They're learning how to play hockey, essentially, and they get together at night and they flood the rinks outdoors, and they train. Like they go through drills, and they're doing push-ups on the ice, and then they scrimmage at the end. They have games that they play. But so I shot some interviews and some content with them last winter, and that's one of those things too where I'm just sitting on it. I don't know what's going to happen with it or where it's going to go. I'll probably pick it up again maybe this winter and revisit it. But yeah, that's really exciting, because I also really love hockey. That's another thing about me.
Yeah, always fun to take those personal projects, personal things that you really love, and then to investigate them further through other people's stories. So what happens? I've been curious about this, about my own films. What happens to all of that footage that you're not using? Does it just sit in your archive? Do you ever use it again? What happens to it?
Yeah, it's collecting dust.
Putting
well,
room
hopefully
for.
It's not collecting dust on my hard drive, but because that would be a problem. But
yeah,
yeah, but yeah, it's once I kind of, carve out the story from what I've captured, it just kind of gets left behind. I've never been asked that before. I guess I don't really know how I feel about that either. I'm sure there's use for it, but everything boils down to time too.
Right. Yeah. So this has been so exciting and so fascinating to talk to you about your process. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I suppose, for people who might be aspiring to do this sort of work, they might be feeling like, it's pretty easy as an artist to kind of feel hopeless at times, and I feel that all the time. And so it's just, it's a journey, and I don't think you ever really arrive at the point where you feel like you should arrive. So yeah, follow your curiosity, and that's all we really can do.
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is to just keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah,
Follow your curiosity and not give up and just keep going.
right. Well, that's what I love about your story that we created too with your discovery exhibit. That's sort of what you did. It was, following that inner voice and putting one foot in front of the other, knowing that it's not always comfortable, but
Right.
there's something that's pushing you forward that you can't ignore. And you arrive somewhere. Maybe it's not where you thought you would arrive, but it's the point where you should be.
Yeah, exactly. I think we all arrive exactly where we should. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. This has been so much fun. And
Thank you.
I will link to all of these things so people can watch a number of your pieces, and keep doing fabulous work out there.
Wonderful. You too.
All right. Thanks.